Dr. Mark, really excited to have you on board, and so I want to start off actually by asking you, what have you, as you know, we talk about business and life at GrowthGen. What have you done for yourself this month? I know that you've been to one of our boards, but I want you to share that with us now before you start your presentation.
What have I done this month? Yeah, you threw me right in the bus there.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to, because I was like, he's been to a board, he'll be fine.
This month, I did submit my book, so I had to submit my book to the publishers, which we talked about at the board because I was pretty stressed about that and trying to keep everything else in the air at the same time as finishing that on time. That did get in. A few other things fell on the ground, but it's now at the publishers and I can focus on picking up some of those balls that I dropped while I was trying to get that finished and into the publishers. So yeah, I got one big thing done and a few things fell off, but yeah, hey, that's life.
Yeah, and that's life. That's absolutely fine, and we can't wait to see it published. And as you know, someone will leave with a book today as well. So as soon as that book is published, I'll send that to you. But we are going to put you in that wheel alongside the speakers that we have to make sure that you win. So let me introduce you. So Dr. Mark is a professor of cognitive neuroscience with over 25 years experience conducting behavioral and brain imaging research. He was awarded numerous fellowships and grants and worked at MIT in the USA and multiple universities in Australia. He has considerable media experience with many television and radio appearances featuring his research on topics ranging from facial expressions, emotions, racism, to how the brain processes smells and why we can't tickle ourselves. Mark's work has been featured in outlets globally, including the New York Times, the Economist, the Guardian, New Scientist. He now runs programs for schools and businesses on neuroscience of learning, the neuroscience of emotions, and impact of modern technologies on our brains. He has an upcoming book called The Connected Species, and we want to welcome him to GrowthGen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. So we're going to talk about communication. I can't communicate myself, can I? We're going to talk about communication today. Of course, as a small business, communication is really vital. If you're in a large multinational, of course, you'd have departments that would look after your HR, your sales, your advertising, your PR, your development, and looking after your suppliers as well. As a small or medium business, of course, we have to do most of this or all of this ourselves. And how to communicate to each of these different groups is really quite difficult because each of them requires different ways of handling them and also of actually communicating with them. So it's a really difficult, but a very, very important aspect of running a small business because you have to be constantly changing what you're actually doing and how you're dealing with people. So understanding how we communicate and understanding the intricacies of communication is, I think, really, really important for anybody trying to run a medium or small business. Now, one of the biggest problems with our brains is that they're not actually capable of doing much at the same time. So there's two types of memories that we really need to understand. I'm going to run through this really quickly, and I think you'll understand why we need to understand these before we can understand communication. The two things are working memory and long-term memory. Working memory is your consciousness. It's what you're aware of at any one point in time. So it's what we're able to process and manipulate and think about at any one time. So at the moment, hopefully you're all listening to my voice and your brain, using your working memory, is interpreting that information and then deciding on whether or not you believe what I'm saying or don't believe what I'm saying and how you're going to actually interpret that. And it then gets laid down in what's called a temporary store if it's held in your working memory for long enough. And then at night when you're sleeping, it'll be transferred to your long-term memory so that you actually remember it. But it doesn't get transferred to your long-term memory unless A, you sleep enough. So another important thing is sleeping, but you've got to sleep 8 to 10 hours or a lot of that information won't be transferred. But B, it's not transferred unless it's held in your long-term memory for long enough for it to be then put into your temporary store for it then to be transferred to your long-term memory. So that's why working memory is really important. But your working memory is really quite limited in what you can actually think about. So we think about, what we talk about is that we only have 7 slots, plus or minus 2, in our working memory that we can hold information. So I'll give you a quick example of that. If I asked you to remember these letters, X, M, A, R, V, E, L, C, O, M, I, C, U, S, P, E, R, M, A, N, X, and I said, I'm going to actually test you on that later, it'd be really, really difficult because we only have 7 slots and all those letters would take up a slot each. So there's not actually enough slots for you to remember all that information. You might try and chunk some of it, but it's still really difficult. Or you might come up with some mnemonic related to those letters to remember it, but it still would be really, really difficult because we only have those 7 slots. If I asked you to remember X, Marvel, comic, Superman, and X again, you'd be able to remember that really easily, yeah? And it's exactly the same letters. So the letters are the same. The only thing that's changed is that on the right-hand side are words that you have in your long-term memory. And so you're able to remember those really easily because they're in your long-term memory. And so then you would be able to hold probably about 5 or 6, maybe 4 of those words that are in your long-term memory while you're also manipulating things. Now, why is this important? It's really important for multiple reasons. One is that when we're actually talking to someone, we need to concentrate on them 100% because our ability to communicate verbally, our language ability is really, really new ability. And our brains actually haven't evolved to allow us to easily communicate via words. So complex language has only been around for about 150,000 years. And that's really nothing in regards to our evolution. And most of the areas that are involved in that are actually areas that were used for other things and they're now being used for verbal communication, which means that verbal communication or written communication, which is what we mainly do these days, is a really new sense that requires all of our working memory. All of our working memory. But then we have a whole bunch of other senses that have been evolving for millions of years to allow us to communicate, because we haven't been communicating only for 150,000 years. We've been communicating for millions of years because we've been living in groups for millions of years. So how did we do it before we had complex language? Well, we did it via a whole bunch of other senses. We did it via our body language. We did it via our facial expressions. We did it via our face itself, by our eyes, where our eyes are gazing, where we're actually looking. We did it by pheromones, so smelling someone and recognizing whether or not there's someone you like or someone you don't like. So all of these things actually told us a lot about our brains. And all of that information is actually in our long-term memories, and all of that information is done automatically without us even thinking about it. So we do that automatically, but most of us don't realize we're doing it automatically. And because we are constantly task switching these days, so we're switching from one task to another, our working memory, which would normally be aware of that information, isn't aware of that information. So what we need to do is slow down, and we need to focus on one thing and one thing only when we are actually communicating with people. Otherwise, we don't take notice of those extra aspects of the information that we're actually receiving because our working memory is so limited. Why is our working memory so limited? Well, our consciousness only has a capability of having those 7 slots in our working memory. And also our attention actually decides what can get into the working memory and what is going to be rejected. And because our world is so complicated, most of the stuff actually gets rejected. Most of it's ignored and only a small amount gets in. I like to think of it as trying to drink through a fire hose. You know, there's no way you could drink the water that's coming out of a fire hose. So what you do is just drink a tiny little bit of it, and the rest of it just gets lost. It can go all over the place. And that's the same as what happens when we're trying to move around the world and actually communicate with people. We lose most of the information, and most of the information that we actually use is actually based on our long-term memory, because we're only getting a small amount of information. So our attention is being captured constantly, and we're only getting a small amount of information actually into our short-term memory or our working memory to enable us to actually communicate. This is Claire would know all about this. This is Times Square, and this is the advertising on steroids. These companies pay huge amounts of money to have these advertisements, but of course they use all the tricks of the trade to actually capture our attention. And of course they are faces, colors, noise, and sound, and movement, sorry. So noise, movement, color, and faces all attract our attention, and they're constantly attracting our attention. And of course, devices do this as well. We're constantly being attracted to devices because they use exactly the same thing. And so when we're on devices, this is a great study that was done a couple of years ago that's been replicated a lot of times. If you have your phone next to you on your desk and it's turned off, your phone's next to you and it's on your desk and it's turned off, your working memory capacity is significantly affected by the fact that your phone is close to you if it's turned off and it's near you. And also your fluid intelligence, your intelligence level is significantly affected if your phone is next to you and turned off. And it's equivalent to having one standard drink. If your phone's turned on, it's equivalent to having, they say, having a cone. So it's equivalent to being stoned. It's much, much worse than this. Why is this important for communication? Well, we know if somebody has a phone on a desk or a phone in front of them, people won't have serious conversations with that individual. Conversations are a lot more shallow when somebody has a phone on a desk or on a table next to them or in front of them. Which means that if you want to have a serious conversation with one of your employees, or you want to have a serious conversation with a client, or you want to have a serious conversation with somebody who you're a supplier that you're working with and you want to negotiate down and get a better price, by having the phone next to you means that they're not going to have a serious conversation with you because they're going to think that you're going to be interrupted by that phone, or that your attention is on that phone, or their attention is going to be on that phone or on their phone, because of the fact that they capture our attention, which means your working memory is not on what you're actually saying, it's on the phone. And we know that is true through a lot of research. So how does connection work? The most important thing is you've got to actually connect to someone. And the only thing that can really override all of that attentional capturing that you can do through marketing, through color, through movement, through sound, through faces, is actually having a connection with somebody. So you can actually create a stronger connection with someone else that can actually override that. But that takes time and it takes concentration. And it's really, really important to establish that connection before you can actually start to work with somebody. How do you create that connection? One, it's most important is doing it face-to-face if you can. So face-to-face results in a whole bunch of extra neurotransmitters being released that you don't get when you're on a device. When we're on a device, we do get dopamine because we are actually seeing somebody's face. So you get dopamine, which is really important for remembering what's going on. But if you're face-to-face, you also get serotonin and you get cortisol, not cortisol, you get serotonin and you get, I've forgotten the word, don't worry about it. I'll remember it in a moment. You get two more neurotransmitters. Those neurotransmitters are really important for actually connecting. So when we're face-to-face, we get pheromones. So through our nose, we get pheromones released from the other person, which activates those other senses, which are really important. The other thing is we have touch, and touch is extremely important for creating bonds between people. In all societies, we have some way of greeting each other, which involves touch. If you're in more stoic societies like Australia and the US, we actually shake hands. If you're in some of the more liberal countries like in Europe, you kiss on the cheeks. Even the Inuits, who are fully covered, rub noses because it's the only part of their body that's actually showing. Why do we do that? Because on our hairy skin, we have what we call C fibers, and those C fibers are just there for touch. They're only there for touch, and they activate a very special area of our brain, which is involved in releasing serotonin, which increases the connection between people. So we know that if you touch someone, they're more likely to buy something from you. If you touch someone, they're more likely to be involved in a survey with you. If you touch a bus driver when you get on a bus, they're more likely to give you the fare for free. So they're more likely to give you stuff if you just touch them. All you've got to do is touch their arm and they're more likely to actually collaborate with you. They're more likely to engage with whatever you want to do. So touch is extremely important. The other thing is we can't read each other's body language. I try to move my hands a lot when I'm on devices and stuff, but when we're on devices, we don't have all the information regarding body language that we do when we're face to face, which is an issue and causes problems. But the most important problem is that eye gaze. We can't know where people are actually looking. So at the moment, all of your faces are looking towards me. But of course, you may not be actually looking towards me. You may be looking somewhere else. And that's really odd, right? If we're all sitting around in a group, you wouldn't all be staring at me. You would be looking at other things. I'd be pointing out things and you'd be looking at those. And so we wouldn't have this strange interaction where we're all looking at each other all at the same time. We would be looking at just the speaker, and then the speaker would use their eye gaze to get you to look at other things when you're actually talking. You lose all of that when you're on devices. So talking face-to-face is really important for that connection. The other reason you've got to create that connection is that we actually listen to people differently when we don't have that connection. So we have evolved to connect with people, but we've evolved to connect with people who we see as part of our in-group, and we disconnect from people who we see as part of our out-group. And there's a great Oprah Winfrey show back in 1992 with brown-eyed versus blue-eyed people. And all they did was they just separated all of the audience into brown-eyed people and into blue-eyed people. And they told them that the brown-eyed people were more intelligent and more nice, and they were better people than the blue-eyed people. And very, very quickly, the brown-eyed people started having a go at the brown-eyed people, and the brown-eyed people started getting very aggressive, which of course then reinforced the brown-eyed people opinion of the blue-eyed people and so on. And they actually had to stop that show early because of how riled up the audiences got, just based on separating into brown-eyed people versus blue-eyed people, which was a ruse, of course. But what it showed was, and it was based on a huge amount of research, that we very quickly associate with our in-groups, who's in our in-group, who we're connected with, and who we're not. And all of that, again, is done in our long-term memory. So that's done in this part of our memory that we have no access to, has a whole bunch of rules, has a whole bunch of stereotypes, and all of that happens without our knowledge. Yeah, and we react to it, and we react to it really quickly. We can put people into groups and just tell them, you're in this group or you're in that group, stick them in the scanner, and they will actually perceive things differently based on that. So we perceive faces differently, objects differently, and words differently, depending on whether we're in the in-group or we're in the out-group. We empathize and have theory of mind differently when we're in the in-group versus the out-group. We detect threat from our out-group, and we don't detect threat from our in-group. So we're much more likely to trust people in our in-group. We have Schadenfreude, which is just the idea that we actually enjoy seeing someone being hurt who's in our out-group, and we have empathy for someone within our in-group. And I'll show you a little study. This was actually a friend of mine who published this work in Journal of Management. What they did was they just got two groups of people and they told them they were in one group or another group. And then they gave them inspirational words. And the inspirational words are exactly the same for both groups. But they just told them they were either from their in-group or their out-group. And these are your hearing, basically your ability, what you're actually hearing, areas of the brain. So they scanned them while they were listening to these inspirational things. If they thought the speaker was in their in-group, then they heard what was being said. If they were in their out-group, they didn't hear what they were saying. They didn't actually process what was being said, but they did if it was non-inspirational. So they heard the negative things the out-group members were saying, and they heard the inspirational things that the in-group members were saying. So even if somebody's part of, if someone's part of your out-group and you say something inspirational to them, they're not actually going to hear it. And they're going to hear it differently. I did a study as well where we actually just changed people's perception of a whole group of not real people. And we gave them faces, and we got them to actually learn which people were nice people, which people were bad people, based on a whole bunch of these vignettes that we gave them. We then scanned them, and we showed that when you present somebody who somebody thinks isn't a very nice person, they perceive them smiling as though it's an angry face. So that all of their bodily responses and their brain responses are identical to an angry face, when you see someone smiling that you don't think is part of your in-group. What's really interesting is we then asked all the participants, how did you remember who was in the nice group and who was in the bad group, who was in the not very nice group? And all of them said, oh, it was really easy because all the people in the nice group were really attractive and all the people in the bad group were really, really ugly. And the faces were all randomized. So they changed between participants. There was no difference in the faces. There couldn't be because they were randomly selected for each participant and each participant got different faces. So you actually see them as more attractive if they're in your group and less attractive if they're in your out group, which means creating these groups is really important. Connecting with people and creating a group where people actually feel as though they're part of your group means they're actually going to hear what you're saying, means that they're going to actually be willing to buy things from you. They're going to give you cheaper things as well. They're going to be more likely to negotiate with you. They're going to hear when you're being inspirational, when you're actually saying things nice to them, and they're actually going to find you more attractive. If they're part of your out group, the opposite happens. You're less likely to get connection. You're less likely that they're not going to hear the inspirational things you say. They're going to hear the negative things and so on. And so it doesn't really matter how you're communicating with someone once they feel as though they're part of that out group. And all of that is automatic. All of that is in your long-term memory and it happens automatically. And the more distracted you are, the more you rely on all those automatic stereotypes in our long-term memory. So we've got to be more careful when we're working that we're not multitasking, that we're actually just doing one thing at a time, because our brains, as we've talked about, aren't capable of multitasking. Yeah, what we're doing is task switching. And when we task switch, what we're doing is we're relying on our long-term memory and all these stereotypes, and we're not actually cognitively thinking about what's actually going on and being able to then respond to those stereotypes to stop them from us making bad decisions and communicating poorly with other people. So we've got to slow down and we've got to focus on one thing at a time rather than trying to multitask. So quickly, I think I've got a little bit of time. Yeah, I do. A few tips on how to communicate better. One of them is listen. So we know that over the last 15 years, there's less gaps when people talk. So when people talk to each other, there's less downtime. There's less time where people stop and actually just think about what's just been said. Because people today are always thinking of what they're going to say next, rather than listening to what the person's actually saying. So we've got to realize that it's okay to have periods where there's quiet, where there's no noise. But because we all spend so much time on devices and we're all so busy these days, busy getting not much done, we're not stopping and we're not allowing ourselves to listen. Then during that little quiet break, think about how to respond and then respond. We all just jump in with what we're thinking about. If someone jumps in, if somebody says something as soon as you stop talking, it means that they've been using their working memory to work out what they're going to say next and not listening to what you're saying. So we need to give them a break to realize that you're actually listening to them and that you're responding to what they've said, not just to what you think you should be saying to them, and not just crossing over those little gaps that we don't want. We also need to observe. So it's really important to observe how people are responding. People will respond differently to you. We know that if someone's leaning forward, yeah, then they're actually more interested. Thank you, Leanne. It looks like you're interested because you're leaning forward, which is awesome. Yeah. And that actually shows interest. There's other aspects to interest as well. People can be leaning back like Marjorie is, but she's also obviously interested because she keeps nodding and making facial gestures, which suggests that she's actually interested. So it's not, there's not these hard and fast rules, but there are a lot of really easy, and we know what those are as long as we stop and we actually wait and we look at what people are doing. And too many people these days don't, and they just soldier on in response to what's actually been, you know, what they're supposed to say. They know what they're supposed to say. They've got it all in their working memory, and they're not using their working memory to communicate. They're using their working memory to tell someone what they want to tell them. But we need to communicate rather than simply tell. The other thing is, as I said, communication is really difficult with devices. We know that if two people are working on one device, there's more arguments, that they're actually more likely to actually disagree with what's actually happening. That's when this sort of thing happens. And the reason for that is that because devices are really good at attracting our attention. So what those two people are doing is they're both looking at the device. They're not looking at each other, which means that they're not reading their facial expressions. They're not reading their eye gaze. They're not reading their body language. And so therefore they're not detecting when the other person's getting frustrated or when the other person doesn't agree. Yeah. And so what we need to do is, if we actually want to collaborate with someone, we need to get rid of the devices and get out the old whiteboard or, pen and paper, whatever you want to use, and do it that way. And then pick up the device later on when you're by yourself. Devices are fantastic if you're by yourself and you need to get stuff done, as long as you turn off all the notifications. They work really well. But when you're actually trying to collaborate, you need to get rid of them because they're specifically designed for solo work. And they're specifically designed to capture your attention and keep you on the device and get you to ignore the person beside you. So if you're trying to communicate with the person beside you, you need to get rid of them so that we actually communicate like this. And yeah, we'll go on to the next one. And then we also need to get rid of the devices when we're having big meetings, because when you're having a big meeting, as I said, if the device is turned off, but it's there, 10% of your attention's still on it. So everyone who's in the meeting has a device there, they might as well have had standard drink before they came on. If the device is turned on, which is usually the case, then they might as well be stoned while they're actually in there. The amount of attention that actually goes to the device without us actually having any control over it is equivalent to us being stoned. So if you want all your employees to be stoned, then let them all have their devices in the boardroom when you're actually discussing good, important ideas. If you don't, tell them all to leave them in their offices and bring a pen and paper, and you will get better thinking happening. As an aside, if you actually want innovation and creativity does not happen by sitting in a boardroom and going, let's come up with these good ideas and then have a brainstorming session. Innovation and creativity actually happens at night when you're asleep. What you want to do is send them a list, email them a list of the things that you want to discuss and you want innovative and creative ideas on. Give them a little brief on it and tell them in 3 or 4 days, we're going to discuss this. At night when they're sleeping, we go through REM sleep, and that's when innovation and creativity actually happens, because all of the things that are in your brain start whirling through. And then we go through scenarios. We go through thousands of scenarios in fast forward when we're sleeping and going through REM sleep. And all innovation and creativity happens then. So if you do that, then they'll come to that meeting 2 or 3 days later with a lot more good ideas than they would have if you had got them in and surprise them with some idea and said, let's do a brainstorming session, because they don't work. Sorry, that was an aside. I shouldn't have mentioned that, should I? But yeah, get them to leave their devices in the office and come with pen and paper, and you'll get much more attention from all your employees, and they'll be thinking about talking to you. The other thing, of course, we know that the water cooler is no longer the place where people start collaborating. In the old days, people used to go to the water cooler, they used to go to the kitchenette, or they'd talk to each other in the lift, and people would actually get to know each other. People would start collaborating, people would know each other. These days, everybody's on a device in those locations, and so they don't actually talk to each other. So there's far less collaboration across groups or across people within organizations because of the fact they're all on their devices. So it doesn't actually happen. It also doesn't happen before meetings because everyone comes with their device. And if the meeting hasn't started yet, they'll look up things on their device, usually random things that don't really matter. If you get them to leave all their devices, especially their phones in their office, when they come to a meeting, they'll talk to each other before the meeting starts, and they'll actually know each other better, which means that they'll collaborate better, which means you'll get more innovation and creativity going between your employees, and the mental health will be better. Best way to improve your mental health, better than any drug that's actually out there, is to sit down and talk to somebody. Sitting down and talking to someone activates more of your brain than anything else you can do in face-to-face. Activates any more your brain than anything else you can do, and is better for your mental health than any drug we have available today. And the final one is download your thoughts before you go to a meeting. If you've got a serious conversation you've got to have with someone, download your thoughts, write notes about everything you're just thinking about, put it away, and then have the discussion with whoever you're having a discussion with. And also offload your phone. Either turn it off and lock it away in a cabinet before you have the discussion. If you're lucky enough to have, PR or something, give it to your PR before you have serious conversations with people and get them to put it somewhere else. But you've got to get rid of your phone. You've got to offload your phone. You've got to download your thoughts so that you're not thinking about all the stuff that's going on. Everybody, as small business owners, we've all got thousands of these things in our heads and thousands of things that we've got to do. But we've got to get rid of all of those out of our working memory so that that really limited capacity that we have can be used to focus on the person that's in front of us so that we can have proper conversation with them, so that we can connect with them properly, so that we can know how they're feeling and respond to that in the moment. And then we can get back to all that other stuff that's in our heads. But download it first, put it in a notepad or put it in your phone or put it wherever you like to put all your thoughts, and then get rid of it before you have those serious conversations. And I think I am right on time. And as Eob said, I've got the book coming out early next year, Connected Species, which is a lot of this stuff and a lot more. And that's my email and my website if you want to check me out. But thank you all for listening. And I think we've got about 5 minutes for questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Mark. That was so insightful. Please give a round of applause, if you don't mind, just a virtual clap. That would be amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Mark. I'll go around the room and see if there are any questions. So if you, as always, please raise your hands if you have a question for Dr. Mark, and we'll take 1 or 2 questions. Any questions? No, all good. I've got a question. So you said that, there's a lot of teams these days that take it in their laptops and their devices into these team meetings.
Yeah.
And it's almost like all companies are allowing it to do it, allowing them to do that. I mean, really, it's become a part of the culture, if you want to call it, bringing in your laptop so that you can take notes to the next session. I totally agree. From a creative perspective, you definitely don't need devices. You just need that whiteboard. You need people to talk to. You need to bounce ideas and work through that. But how are we going to stop that? Do you think, it really is now ingrained in the culture. Would you still recommend that if you went to a corporate company, for example, Dr. Mark?
Yes. So whenever I go and work with corporations, with companies, I always say this is the guidelines, and if you don't like these, then that's fine, but I'm not coming otherwise. But one of those is that no one's allowed to bring a device to the workshop. So the workshop, they have to come to the workshop with pens and paper, and I always give out paper handouts so that they can all work from those. But there's no devices in the thing, and every time I've done that, I've had amazing feedback from the people who have organised it about how interactive everybody was and how much everybody enjoyed it, and how people were talking during the morning tea and how people were talking during the lunch, and how people weren't ducking off to check, some tweet that they just got or some like that they just got, because it's so important for us to actually connect. We know productivity's down now than it was 10 years ago in workplaces, right? It actually is affecting our productivity because we're task switching all the time. That's really draining, which means that we're not getting as much done. We're not having deep thought and deep thinking that we used to have. So by getting rid of all of that stuff, you can do that. You can have deep thought, you can have deep thinking. One of the things I do a lot of teaching around is using Pomodoro technique. So Pomodoro technique is where you just focus on one thing for 25 minutes and do nothing else during that period. Now, to do that properly, you've got to get rid of all your devices, right? And you've got to get rid of all notifications and anything like that, because they're going to distract you and they're going to mean that you're not focusing on the one thing for 25 minutes. But it has been shown to be the most productive way to actually set out your day. And I always try and have at least one session of Pomodoro, which is 2 hours, sometime during the day. And I find that I get more done during that 2 hours than I do for the rest of the day, because of the fact that I can concentrate on one thing during that and get shit done. And that's what's important, right? That's what we need to be doing. That's what employees need to be doing. And you're not when you actually got the devices there in front of you. Teaching people that when you go to a meeting, you get rid of the device. Yes, you can have virtual meetings where you've got to do that. I was working with a HR company at the middle of this year, because they're having a lot of trouble with connection and getting back together and everything, because everybody was working from home and nobody was actually connecting. So we got together, we got everybody together, and they weren't allowed to bring their devices and all the rest of it. And now they're doing together once a week. So they have one day a week where they all get together without devices and all that, and they just spend a day together. And the mental health issues have really dropped off because of that. They're all connecting better because of that. The company's flourishing since then because of that. Because it's really important. We are social animals, and we've got to actually connect, and we've got to connect properly, not this way, but actually face to face with each other. And if we want to collaborate, and if we want to actually be innovative together, which is how we got to where we are now, then we've got to actually do it face to face and without the distraction of the devices.
Yeah, very important to do that. I know that a lot of our members use the Pomodoro as well. I know that Marjorie does the same as well. So very important, a great technique. Claire, what was your question?
Yeah, well, firstly, I've just realized I'm doing Pomodoro all wrong, because I spend 25 minutes changing subjects between in that time, and then I need to focus, I guess. But my question was, with the downloading your thoughts and the kind of journaling aspect, do you recommend just kind of letting your thoughts run free, or do you ask questions? Like, how do you kind of structure that, or if at all?
Yeah, no, I don't. So there's different types of journaling, and I do different types of journaling. So in the first thing in the morning, I get up at 6 o'clock every morning. And I drink water, and I make a cup of coffee, and I sit down and I have a note. I have a journal that I have stuff in the front of it, which is what I want to get done in the next 6 months, which I go through because I want to make sure that I'm still on track. And then I write just my thoughts from the night before, and my thoughts for the day and what I want to get done. When I'm going into a meeting or something like this, or an event or whatever, I'll sit down and just write down all the stuff that I was thinking about that day that I need to do, but I want to get rid of. So it's basically the stuff in my head, which is I've still got to do this and I've still got to do that, and it's all that stuff. Yeah, it's all the junk that's in your head that when you're talking to someone is going to distract you, or when you're doing an event, it's going to distract you, or when you're trying to have deep thought, it's going to distract you. So it's all that stuff, so that I don't think about it, or if it does come up, I can go, it's written down, so I don't have to worry about it. Yeah, because our brains are really good at going, what do I have to remember, and continually trying to bring those up into our consciousness, into that working memory, so that we don't forget it. But if we've got it written down, then it's downloaded, so you don't have to remember it. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks.
That's great. Marjorie.
Doctor, I was going to ask about how can we take better care of our brains? So I know that they say you should be eating, like we really should be eating food that's great for our brains.
Yeah.
What do you recommend? Like I know you said sleep as well is a really important one. What other ways can we really nourish our brains?
Yeah, it's, sadly it's all the boring things, right? It's eating healthy and eating fresh food. It's been shown that it's actually, there's this amazing link between your gut and your brain. I remember it was about 10 years ago, I got asked to do a symposium at a psychiatrist conference. And I was really interested because all the talks that morning before I came on were all on the gut. None of them had to do with actually doing therapy. It was all on the gut and gut therapy, and amazing changes they were seeing in mental health associated with changing people's diet. Just changing someone's diet can actually improve their mental health, which is amazing. So yeah, eating lots of nuts and eating lots of raw foods is really important. Water is really important, staying hydrated. So just straight water, which is why I drink 2 glasses of water every morning just to get started. Exercise, of course, keeping just overall healthy, because your brain uses 25% of the blood flow in your whole body, so it uses a lot of blood flow. So having good blood flow by being physically healthy means your brain is going to be healthier as well, and you're going to decrease the likelihood of having things like strokes or mini strokes that can occur, which are called ischemic attacks. And then sleep is really important. So to remember what you did during that day, you have to attend to something for long enough for it to be put into your working memory. Sorry, for your working memory to have it in there for long enough for it then to go into your temporary store, but then it needs to get stored in your memory. Now at night, what we do is we go backwards through what happened. So you start storing the last thing you did during the day and you go backwards through it. But you've got to have at least 8 hours sleep for it all to be stored. Yeah. So you'll forget, you won't store the first things you did in the morning if you don't have full 8 hours sleep that night. And so it just gets erased so you can start again the next day. So having that 8 hours is really important. But it's also important because during that period, you also get rid of all the neurotoxins and stuff that are in your brain. So it resets your brain, it resets your emotional state. It does a lot of really important things during sleep to actually improve your brain. So that's also really important. So yeah, food, exercise, water, and sleep are probably would be my top 4. Apart from the obvious ones, which is, don't drink too much alcohol, don't take drugs, the things we tell kids, put a helmet on if you're going to ride a skateboard, all of that stuff.
Awesome. Dr. Mark, thank you so much for today's session. That was amazing. So really looking forward to seeing that recording come out as well. But yeah, thank you for joining us at Growth Gen.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, everyone.